All right, today we're going to break down the Ray Peat philosophy and bioenergetic view from a very basic level, the escalator, the eagle's eye view of what bioenergetics is, who Ray Peat was a little bit, and everything you kind of need to know to dip your toes into the pro-metabolic water, if you will. So let's dive in. Today we are going to break down the basics of bioenergetics, talk a little bit about Ray Peat and the pro-metabolic history, and dive into kind of everything you need to know to understand a lot about what is going on online, and dive into a little bit more of these in-depth interviews in this pro-metabolic world with the foundations that you need to know and are often overlooked or not talked about as much. So let's do it. First, Ray Peat, one of the founders of the pro-metabolic lens or bioenergetic view, and he would tell you that he based his opinion or his research largely on people, so many of the greats like Gilbert Ling, Albert Szent-Györgyi, among many others like Pavlov, and on and on. Ray was specifically a scientist who got his PhD in biology from Oregon, where he studied and focused on progesterone, among other human hormones. The biggest takeaway from Ray, I think, is perceive, think, act, which is on his website. It's like the main thing. But he's most known for his work in metabolism. So I have a couple of his quotes here, which I'll go through throughout this. But what could be more important to understand than biological energy? Thought, growth, movement. Every philosophical and practical issue involves the nature of biological energy. And this is where the bioenergetic view differs. So there's really two contrasting views in terms of the views of longevity, but also kind of how we live. So there's the rate of living theory and the bioenergetic view, and these are directly in contrast to one another. The rate of living theory basically views animals and humans specifically as machines. So the heart is a great example here. In the rate of living theory, you want to slow down the rate at which the heart beats so that because you have a limited number of beats. So over time, this functional machine that we call heart, which is beating, you only get so many beats. So the less often it beats, the longer you will live as a result of that. The bioenergetic view, again, is in direct contrast to that, where it does not necessarily believe that we are machine-like in the sense that we can repair, or we have the ability to generate energy and repair our tissue, our living tissues. We're living and breathing organisms versus things that are central to decay. There's this quote from, I think, Naval, where basically he says that I'm locally reversing entropy, which means entropy means disorder, and life always tends towards disorder. The whole world always tends to disorder. But as living beings, we are very ordered in the sense that we are creating a lot of energy. We are not at this time, we are at this time losing energy, but we are a concentration of energy, and disorder essentially means that energy tends to disperse over time, which is why you have things like the galaxies constantly expanding and things constantly explode like the Big Bang Theory and whatnot. So humans and everyone is kind of a little negative entropy pocket. We're a little bucket of energy, and as long as we live, we are continuing to fight entropy. And when we die, we essentially lose that battle with entropy. Back to the rate of living theory versus bioenergetics. This is fundamental to Ray's work and to the pro-metabolic world, because we believe that energy and metabolism are tied at every level to essentially everything that goes on in life. So when you have issues, it's not necessarily just a leaky part or something that needs to be broken, but it's a systemic problem that is having a local realization, if that makes sense. So what that could mean is you're having a nutrient deficiency, and for some reason that's causing your gut to be messed up. This is where things like, I'm going to use the scapegoat genetics, but we just really don't understand why these things are, why certain people get certain diseases necessarily. Sometimes it is genetic related, but very often we just say genetics because we don't really understand why it's happening. But we can all, who is it? As one of Ray Peat's other mentors has said, in the body, as in a chain, the weakest link breaks down under stress, although all parts are equally exposed to it. So we don't necessarily understand why one part is more exposed to it, or why certain thing is the weakest link in a given person, why one person gets this disease, why another person gets that disease. Again, that might be genetics, might be not, might be environmental things. There are certain tendencies for certain metals to accumulate in certain organs, and enzymes to be used in certain things. Obviously, like things like alcohol negatively affect the liver or the lungs with smoking. So there are certain environmental factors that directly target and negatively affect one tissue. But sometimes you just see random things pop up. And I say random, but really just that we very likely don't have an explanation for it. So I want to dive into some of the more nuanced concepts and the basics of bioenergetics. Okay, so the low energy state, Ray does, I'm sure he talks about more than I've seen, but I don't really remember him specifically saying the low energy availability state like Kathleen refers to. Maybe that's because he didn't like the guy, Ansel Keys, who ran the Minnesota starvation experiment, but I do not know. And what Ray is talking about when he's talking about low energy is that the cells have almost like a blockage in their ability to efficiently create ATP. So ATP, adenosine triphosphate, is the main energy source of the cell. And in order to make ATP, you need either fat, protein, and really carbs primarily, which we'll get to, the macros that Ray has talked about, to shuttle through, get from your mouth through your digestive system, into your bloodstream, into your cells, put all the way through, broken down, and then they will eventually yield if properly conducted, if you will. If they go through all the steps properly, they will get you some ATP. Obviously, they do a lot of other things in terms of structural elements, hormones, etc. But a lot of things can go awry on the way there. And a lot of modern medicine, which Ray has notoriously had a lot of gripes with, tend to look at a very individualistic perspective on each thing. Like you go to a kidney doctor, you go to a foot doctor, you go to this. And obviously, I do think there are a place for specializations. There is a place for specializations, but a lot of disease, a lot of issues, health issues that people are having are a lot more systemic than we think. So for example, like inflammation is a very systemic thing. There's a lot of commonalities between the C word, cancer, and diseases like multiple sclerosis. Alzheimer's disease is now being labeled as type 3 diabetes. So if you can optimize cellular energy, the ability for a cell to create energy, properly shuttle the nutrients through it, creating ATP, that kind of byproduct or the end product of metabolism, you will, on the way, solve a lot of things. And so there's this idea in genetics, the one gene, one protein hypothesis, where we're like looking for individual genes that are going to cause or cure cancer if we turn them on and off, or whatever other disease. And we would, in the bioenergetic view, obviously I can't speak for anyone but myself, sort of disagree with that we think that actually that in cancer, in a cancer state, that the genes are actually affected after the cellular energy has gone awry. So let me actually break this down a little bit more in depth. When we theoretically evolved from bacteria only perform glycolysis. So glycolysis is a simpler form of energy production, but it's also what we resort back to when we don't have all the adequate things on the way to go through cellular respiration, which is a more advanced type of metabolism. And those can be micronutrients, they could be PUFAs, they could be just a lot of things that are causing it to go awry. But the main difference is, one, the anaerobic glycolysis, or even aerobic glycolysis, which is not really a thing, but kind of a thing, don't use oxygen. And so they produce a lot of, in at least humans, they produce lactic acid, which can make the cell very basic and can disrupt the fluidity of the cell, making it harder for the cell to make more energy, causing a lot of calcium to enter the cell, kind of basically disrupting the order of the cell if you do too much of it. If you do aerobic glycolysis, or you're in a state where you can perform cellular respiration, you can take in oxygen, pass off the byproducts, the pyruvates, I think, that are made from glycolysis, put it through the mitochondria, and get about 30 times or 15 times as much ATP. And our cells, because they're much more advanced, much bigger than your typical bacteria, rely on this cellular respiration, this aerobic respiration, where we use oxygen in addition to the carbohydrates or whatever substrate we're using as fuel to keep cellular balance. And what you tend to see in a disordered state or a disease state is that the cells in that diseased tissue are no longer properly making energy. So you'll see an increase in lactate in the surrounding tissue. You'll see less carbon dioxide being produced. You will see, more water in these cells because there's less carbon dioxide drawing the water out. The cells are kind of swelling essentially with this extra calcium that's influxing because the carbon dioxide isn't bringing calcium out. And the whole thing is kind of disordered. There's not these ordered cells that are kind of working together beautifully as a team. I like to describe this in a lot of cases. It's mostly a great visual for the blood, but there's a lot of traffic accidents happening in the cell, which is oxidative stress, right? You have all these little electrons that would normally go through this electron transport chain to eventually create ATP. But now they're just like a pinball machine bumping into everything in their way. Every time they bump into something, they're creating oxidative stress as they act as oxidants, and then you need an antioxidant, and then you're just in this cascade where the cell's not actually able to properly flush everything through and is in this state of oxidative stress where it's not producing a lot of energy and is kind of constantly healing itself. So let's go through a couple of the main concepts here. One is CO2. So CO2 is often viewed as kind of like a useless byproduct in the cell or in the body, but CO2 seems to be very essential for metabolism, and the reason being is the Bohr-Haldane effect. So the Bohr-Haldane effect basically describes how hemoglobin, which is the main molecule in your red blood cells, is able to transport oxygen from the air into your bloodstream, into your cells, change shape when it gets to your cells, give off that oxygen, absorb carbon dioxide that comes out, and then go back to your lungs, drop off the carbon dioxide, pick up the oxygen, and repeat. This is due to what are called the Bohr-Haldane effects, where essentially the acidity of the cells, because as you get further and further away from your body, or into the body, closer to the cells, into the tissues, the areas tend to become more acidic compared to the lungs. So you get this change in shape, and that's partially from carbon dioxide driving that increase in acidity. So that it forces the hemoglobin to change shape, which drops off all the oxygen, picks up carbon dioxide on the way, goes back to the lungs. Now it's no longer that acidic. It changes shape, drops off the carbon dioxide, picks up oxygen, and this rinse, wash, repeat happens over and over again. The way I like to describe this is like hemoglobin acts as both the catcher and the pitcher. So there's two different positions. It can drop off oxygen as the catcher, and it can pick up carbon dioxide as the pitcher, picking up the ball and throwing it away. And because of this has some important details as well, that the more carbon dioxide you produce, the more oxygen you can pick up, which means your cells get a greater supply of oxygen, which means that you can locally and systemically upregulate metabolism through upregulating metabolism. So what I mean by this is if you are getting more ATP, producing more ATP, using more glucose to produce, which produces more carbon dioxide than fat or amino acids, you will increase the rate at which you are respiring. Your mitochondria are working, firing, producing more ATP, which produces more carbon dioxide, which then allows your hemoglobin cells to absorb more oxygen than they normally would be able to because of this increased acidity locally, and then give off more oxygen to the cells. So it's this feedback loop where you can, by increasing the amount of CO2 that your cells produce, among other things, you can upregulate metabolism locally, possibly systemically, depending on a number of other things. This is also why Ray has talked about how altitude seems to be beneficial for the metabolism because there is less oxygen in the air. And as a result of that, more carbon dioxide there's a higher gradient of carbon dioxide to oxygen in the air. So you'll see this in insurance companies where people at altitude tend to live a little bit longer there's also tends to be lower obesity rates at altitude. And that Ray attributes that, in the bioenergetic view, if you want to say that, to the increased proportion of carbon dioxide at altitude when there is actually less oxygen in the air, but it allows you to more efficiently utilize the oxygen, again, because of that Bohr-Haldane effect, where your body can now pick up more oxygen because of the increased acidity in your body. So going back there to some more of the macronutrient stuff. So Ray has talked ad nauseum probably about sugars and macronutrients. He's a huge fan of sugar. And the reason being, he prefers sugars over starches, but he prefers carbs in general as the main fuel source of the body. And that's because the carbs produce more carbon dioxide per gram than fats and amino acids as well. And again, that is related to the mitochondria and the respiration, where that feedback loop where you produce more carbon dioxide and then you can increase your cellular energy production. The reason he prefers sugars over starches is because sugars are half glucose, half fructose. The fructose goes directly to the liver and doesn't adversely affect, I wouldn't use the word adversely, but doesn't affect your blood sugar. Basically, fructose just goes to the liver and is processed there and either created into glycogen, possibly stored as fat, very small amount of sugar or fructose is stored as fat, or converted into glucose and put into the bloodstream eventually, I believe. I could be wrong on that one. It's been a while. Whereas glucose is the main substrate that your cells use for fuel. So you eat carbs, blood sugar goes up, your cells start taking in some insulin or producing insulin. That tells your cells to absorb all of the energy, or as much energy as they can, and start burning it rapidly. As I've talked about before, insulin sensitivity is essentially a skill where it's like your body's ability to burn carbohydrates. Some people are very insulin sensitive, very good at burning carbs. Hopefully, like myself, some people are not so insulin sensitive and are not able to burn carbs efficiently. This is going to depend on the person, and the amounts that you're consuming at a given time in the context of like when you're eating them. Is it just after another meal? Did you just exercise? Yada, yada, yada. But he saw sugars as a better means for not creating blood sugar spikes. I kind of disagree there. And I do think it depends the context, but a lot of people, in my experience, do really well with starchy carbs for satiety reasons, for energy reasons, for lasting energy. In my opinion, having a sugar and a starch source at every meal tends to give you both, seemingly and anecdotally, from what I've seen in myself and clients, some quick energy with the sugar and some more lasting energy. He also viewed protein as pretty important, but he thinks that a lot of people are getting too much protein, especially the wrong types of protein. So he warned against meat and heavy iron foods and also the inflammatory amino acids. So after a certain point, when you basically stop growing, some of us are still growing, just hopefully putting on muscle, you no longer need a lot of the growth amino acids, for lack of a better term. Some people call these the inflammatory amino acids. And that's going to be cysteine, tryptophan, and methionine, all of which are related to growth and ironically involved in mTOR, which is one of the pathways you see a lot of longevity people attack in terms of longevity, in terms of like not increasing muscle mass. As ironically, by restricting methionine, you can restrict mTOR, which they believe for a number of reasons we're not going to go into. Honestly, I'm not that familiar with them. That is a gateway or way to increase your longevity by not turning mTOR on. So a lot of these Ray Peat things you see echoes of them in a lot of other areas. I do think getting enough protein is important, but he would advocate, one of the things he's notorious for is a lot of glycine, a lot of gelatin, because you do not need a lot of these like muscle meats as you age. So he would advocate for more gelatinous sources, which I think is great. These are things like any tough cut of meat where you have to marinate it is typically a more gelatinous cut. Chicken wings are a good one. Bone broth is known for its high glycine content, gelatin content. Chicken breast, that brown stuff that you see when you put it in the fridge, that's all gelatin. And the skin in general is a great source of gelatin if you can source it well, which brings us to fats and polyunsaturated fats. So fats in general, Ray did not mention he didn't think, at least as the age, that you wanted to be a fat burner. You don't want to be a fat burner. And Kyle Muniz is a great essay on this titled "Why You Don't Want to Be a Fat Burner." But the TLDR here, or the too long didn't read, is for the reasons that we mentioned before, that carbs produce more carbon dioxide than fat per gram consumed. There's also the concept of the Randall cycle, where an individual cell can only, or really mitochondria, can only burn carbs or fats at a given time. I think this is currently being taken out of context to say that you should only eat carbs or fat at different times, like you should separate them. I think that's kind of bogus, because what you see with a lot of the insulin sensitivity is that fats and proteins tend to slow digestion. You also, like, unless you're taking protein powder, really hard to get protein without fats, or you're just eating tons of pure starches, which I am, but not that much. And again, fats tend to slow digestion, so they tend to have a more gradual release of sugars into the bloodstream, which tends to be good for not seeing a huge spike in blood sugar and then a crash, which is what we're really concerned about. We do want your blood sugar to go up, because that's your body saying, okay, let's refuel, let's burn all this. And then as you don't eat for a few hours, it should gradually decline. We just don't want this spike and then drop, spike and then drop. So I think limiting your fat intake to around 0.8 grams per kilogram of your body weight or lean body mass is a great estimate for how much fat you should be consuming on a day-to-day basis. He also had mentioned a lot, keeping your polyunsaturated fat intake to below 3 to 4 grams daily. I do think this depends a little bit on the person, but the polyunsaturated fats tend to be highly unstable. So when we talk about that pinball thing made before, as oxidants occur in the cell, which are like free radicals, basically when you separate oxygen and you try and use it to create energy, you're separating the electrons, which go through the electron transport chain, as we mentioned before. But sometimes this can run amok and you start running into things. And that's when the pinball things, you get these oxidative stress, bum, 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 bum. Every time that an oxidant runs into something that it can bond to, it is resulting in oxidative stress. And an example of this is PUFAs or MUFAs, polyunsaturated fatty acids, or monounsaturated fatty acids, where they have a double bond. This double bond is relatively unstable, or significantly less stable compared to the single bond, because it doesn't allow the atoms to rotate freely at the speed that they would like. So it's more open to saying, oh, hey there, I would like to be a little bit more stable. You have an extra electron you want to bond with, and then all of a sudden now there's 2 electrons coming back and you need an antioxidant to fix this. And so this is where vitamin E, contrasting the effects of PUFA, and Ray has talked about that a lot. But the more PUFAs you eat, the more prone you're going to be to oxidative stress. There's always going to be free radicals, those oxidants bumping around in the cell, because we are not perfect. If we were, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation. But the more saturated your cells are, the more resistant you will be to oxidative stress or inflammation, which are kind of synonymous in my view, at least in part. The other thing about the carbs versus fat argument here is that it's really hard to get a lot of saturated fat in the pure form. The really only advisable ones, I would say, are tallow, depending on the source. Tallow can be sourced pretty poorly. Coconut oil and butter, or ghee, and dairy as well. Super highly saturated. They're all like 80 plus 90%, and then have some MUFAs, have some PUFAs. If you want really saturated fats, but so that other than that, if you're getting it from meat, which most people are, or like fried foods, it's really hard to have saturated fat stores, like your actual fat stores being mostly from saturated versus polyunsaturated fats, if you're not either just eating like actual tubs of fat, or you're eating a very high carb diet. So the advantage to a high carb diet is, in humans, all fat is made into saturated, or all carbs are converted into saturated fat. So if you were going to get fat, it would probably be better to get it from saturated fat. I don't think that eating carbs to the point where you get fat is advisable in any scenario, but it's probably better in the long term for getting fat from carbs rather than getting fat from seed oils, like the things most food is fried in. And seed oils, the reason they're bad is because they have a lot of polyunsaturated and more monounsaturated fats, which are again prone to that oxidative stress, whereas saturated fats are orders of magnitude more resistant to that oxidative stress. So they're more likely to just allow those free electrons, the free radicals, to bounce off rather than causing another oxidative stress or an incident of oxidative stress, a little car accident that happens. Then you need some cop to come over, write an insurance report. That's the antioxidant. And you have this endless cycle of either or feedback loop of more free radicals creating more oxidative stress, needing more antioxidants, versus saturated fats tend to help everything go more smoothly. And these fats tend to organize themselves along the outside of the cellular membrane, or outside of the cell, which some would call the cellular membrane. And that can also be problematic, especially if you have high portions of, again, the unsaturated fats. They also tend to be more prone to, like, that's why people are talking about skin damage in the sun and having high saturated fat stores, because these fats, the saturated fats, can absorb more energy, which is why you see tropical fats, warm weather fats, are all highly saturated. Coconut oil being a great example of which. Salmon, cold water fish, highly unsaturated, largely thought to be because that allows them to not freeze in the colder waters. And so you will see the freezing point of coconut oil very low. Like coconut oil at room temperature is basically solid. Butter, pretty close to solid, like liquid-esque, versus olive oil or any of the other oils, seed oils, they are much more monounsaturated, much more polyunsaturated with some saturated fat, and more, they're always obviously, they are liquid at room temperature. And almond oil, peanut oil, all of the oils, seed oils, vegetable oil, rapeseed oil. It's been a while since I've talked about this stuff, and I never consume it. All the vegetable oils are very liquid at room temperature. Those unsaturated fats allow the fish to continue to maintain their membrane fluidity, if you will, at the cold water temps, the almost freezing water temps that are found in the ocean. Whereas if they were fully saturated, they might freeze. Like, we have a body temperature of 98.6, which is another reason why saturated fats tend to be superior for us, because they're more stable at the higher body temperatures, again, related to the sun as well. Whereas the colder oriented fats, polyunsaturated fats, a little bit more MUFA, are not as stable at temperature. So at higher temperatures, those chemical bonds, those atoms inside there, want to be freed up more and more, versus if you slow them down, less perceptible or less likely to try and jump ships and try and create a new electric bond. Okay. So we covered CO2. I'm going to briefly cover in the inflammatory amino acids. I want to briefly cover some of the electrolytes. So Ray talked a lot about salt and calcium. I think that basically this is more from Chris Masterjohn than Ray, but they talked about similar things. Getting enough salt seems to be really beneficial as long as you are meeting your potassium intake. For people that aren't eating a ton of processed foods, you're very possibly not getting enough salt in your day, especially if you are active and sweating somewhat consistently. The issue with salt in low sodium diets, which do marginally reduce your blood pressure, but not significantly, especially if you're getting potassium or enough potassium, it doesn't really affect your blood pressure at all. Low salt doesn't seem to actually give you any longevity benefits, which is what Ray has talked about. And Chris Masterjohn has tied this to, as long as you're getting your potassium intake in, then salt is kind of like, it's fine, basically. And it tastes good and helps you remain hydrated. Salt is very key to cellular and whole body hydration. Calcium is a similar topic where, paradoxically, even though we find calcium like coronary arteries, like plaque, it seems that actually not getting enough calcium is very detrimental and results in there being higher blood calcium. So you don't want a high blood calcium score, because that is typically what seems to be related to being found in these plaques. But keeping your potassium or calcium intake high seems to actually reduce the amount of calcium in your blood. Very counterintuitively. Calcium also seems to be very important for, obviously, bone density, where it makes your bones, regulating cellular metabolism in the sense of like cell signaling, very important for cell signaling, and myriad of other different things. The last thing I wanted to cover today was the relationship between estrogen and serotonin. These are commonly called, in the bioenergetic view, stress hormones, and they tend to increase water retention, fluidity, and decrease the cell's ability to respire, to metabolize. Estrogen, commonly thought of as one of the earliest hormones, and it's signaling for cells to essentially reproduce, to take up water and replicate, which is great in a position that you want to replicate. But many of us, and especially as we grow and get older, we don't need to be in a constant state of replication. And a constant state of replication is basically what you see in cancer cells, where they are constantly replicating and there's no apoptosis. So they're not really killing themselves. In addition to that, they are consuming food and things at I want to say unbelievable rate, but like disregarding all of the other tissues around. They're just consuming everything as a mass. This also goes into Ray's work in progesterone, where he sees progesterone as the main antagonist to estrogen. And progesterone is usually found in the body at significant higher quantities as estrogen, but for whatever reason, due to like the birth control industries and a lot of medical probably malpractice, you do see estrogen being talked about way more than progesterone, when progesterone is so important to hormones in general, probably for both men and women, especially for women, because they do have higher amounts of estrogen as they're cycling and going through those phases where they are rapidly replicating. And you tend to do see estrogen surrounding the cancer cells and disease states as well. Serotonin is another interesting one that Ray really disagrees with the mainstream view and mainstream consensus that serotonin is like this happy hormone. He believes more so that dopamine is the happy hormone, that serotonin seems to be largely involved in the gut when bacteria sweeps through and causing actually diarrhea and constipation, where you get a serotonin excess and that causes your body to flush things out of the body. So when your gut is irritated, it will release histamine, serotonin, nitric oxide, and things like that to flush the body out. There is some, obviously, I do think serotonin is a little bit important for things like sleep, but again, all of these things in balance. Don't have all the answers here. These are kind of just my thoughts. The other thing that's important to mention there is nitric oxide. So nitric oxide is one of the body's main vasodilators, and it's gotten a lot of popularity, but the other main vasodilator is CO2, and nitric oxide isn't in and of itself a free radical. So it's probably useful in very short-term acute scenarios to increase blood flow, but chronically high levels of nitric oxide seem to be very detrimental, and the cells producing a lot of nitric oxide also seems to be detrimental. All right, and I just wanted to wrap this up with kind of where I think Ray's work is being taken in the wrong way. So Ray, as I mentioned before, his main thing was perceive, think, act, personal responsibility. And I believe he believed that fundamentally what you did not want to do is give your health put it into someone else's hands. You didn't want to go to the doctor and just say, tell me what to take, doc. You wanted to be an advocate for yourself. And I think this is often forgotten, and I'm guilty of this myself, but it's a kind of a meme where it's just like Ray Peat quote, this problem, this supplement. And I think if you asked Ray that, maybe I'm wrong here, I can't speak for him, but I think that if you asked him that, he would probably be kind of like horrified at the notion that people were just taking his word without any context and using it as justification instead of trying a little bit, seeing how it affects you and acting on that, trying it again, being your own scientist. And I think it's really interesting that Ray considered himself a painter more than a scientist, as he's notoriously said. But I think we could all and should all try to do Ray a little bit more justice in acting as scientists for ourselves. I think a lot of Ray's work now is being misconstrued with like biohacking, and everyone's just going to town on like whatever supplements, whatever hormones, which do have a place and can be fun to experiment with and can help a lot of people in certain scenarios. But I do find that a lot of us are skipping the foundational steps of building the metabolism, making sure you're insulin sensitive, consuming enough carbs, getting enough protein, making sure you're eating mostly saturated fats, not consuming too much fat as a whole, which is a big thing that we see, moving daily, getting enough sunlight, vitamin D, which Ray talks about ad nauseum, maybe some caffeine, a vitamin like adaptogen or a nutrient, as Ray has talked about. Possibly, switching some more muscle meats for gelatinous sources, like these are the basic things that I think Ray went on and on about how important they are. But, and again, like I'm not discrediting Ray's work at all. It's been, reading his stuff is awesome. I need to read the rest of his books, but Generative Energy is great. All of his articles are great. They do take you a couple reads to go through, and you might have to look up some terminology. Hopefully some of the things I went over in this talk will help with that. But I really appreciate Ray. I think everything he put out there was awesome. I'm sure some of it wasn't great, but most of what he put out there was awesome. And, you know, his ability to help people is inspiring, and he's just a really cool dude. It's always very interesting how he never corrected anyone and had such a gentle tone. And for anyone that's getting into bioenergetics as I did a few years ago, I hope this helps. Till next time, guys, be good.